Sweat dripped down Jake Thompson's face as he gripped the mop with trembling hands. At 45, his back ached after another day cleaning the hallways of Chicago's most prestigious fighting academy. But that Friday night, something was different. The noise came from the main gym. Screams, taunts, cruel laughter. "Hey, old man, you really think you can get up here?" The mocking voice of Derek the Crusher Martinez echoed through the space. Jake stopped cleaning and looked through the slightly opened door. There he was, the Academy's heavyweight champion, pointing directly at Jake with a disdainful smile. "You're not a fighter!" Derek roared, making the crowd of students explode in laughter. "You're just a failed janitor who cleans up our mess." In that moment, Jake felt something he hadn't felt in over 20 years. An old flame, almost extinguished, began to burn again in his chest. His hands dropped the mop, and for the first time in decades, he didn't lower his head in the face of humiliation. What no one in that academy knew was that the man they saw only as a silent janitor had once been a legend. And that night, Jake Thompson was about to remind everyone why his name once echoed through the most famous rings in the country. But how did a man who had lost everything find the strength to face one of Chicago's most feared fighters? And what dark secret from Jake's past was about to shock not only his tormentors, but the entire American boxing community? This is the true story of a man who proved that the real fight doesn't just happen in the ring, but in the courage to stand up when the whole world told you that you should stay down. Jake Thompson arrived at Fight Club Chicago every day at 5 in the morning, 2 hours before any fighter set foot in the place. On the empty streets of Lincoln Park, only the sound of his footsteps broke the morning silence. He carried an old canvas bag, its straps already worn by time, containing cleaning supplies, rags, and the only thing that connected him to his past, a faded photo kept in the inner pocket. The academy occupied a red brick building that once housed a textile factory. The owners, Brian and Tommy Sullivan, were former fighters who had transformed the space into a modern temple of martial arts. Heavy bags hanging like sentinels, ropes stretched forming perfect rings, and walls covered with photos of champions, some famous, others forgotten by time. Jake knew every inch of that place. He knew exactly where the paint peeled on the north wall, how many tiles were loose in the men's locker room, and on which ceiling beam a moisture stain usually formed during Chicago's rainy days. To the fighters who arrived later, he was practically part of the furniture, a silent ghost who ensured everything was spotless. "Good morning, Jake," Brian Sullivan occasionally mumbled as he passed him, but rarely waited for a response. Jake just nodded and continued his work. Not that he was rude or antisocial. He had simply learned that invisibility was a form of protection. During his 3 years working there, Jake had developed a military routine. First, he checked the safety equipment, ring ropes, heavy bag locks, mat conditions. Then he meticulously cleaned every surface, from mirrors to rubber floors. Finally, he organized gloves, mouth guards, and other equipment left scattered by fighters the night before. It was during these first solitary hours that Jake allowed himself to observe the posters on the walls. Muhammad Ali, delivering the punch that knocked down Sonny Liston, Rocky Marciano celebrating another victory, Mike Tyson in his glory days. Each image was a window into a world he knew intimately, but from which he had been exiled. At 7 in the morning, the first fighters began to arrive. Jake quickly retreated to his small storage room in the back, where he kept cleaning supplies, and an old chair where he ate his ham sandwich during break. From there, he could hear the sounds that filled the academy, the constant rhythm of punches on heavy bags, the noise of ropes when someone climbed into the ring, the instructions shouted by trainers. Derek Martinez always arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, driving a red Camaro that he parked right in front of the entrance, taking up 2 spaces. Tall, strong, with tattoos covering his muscular arms, Derek was everything Jake wasn't, or at least everything Jake didn't appear to be. At 28, Derek had built a fearsome reputation both inside and outside the rings. 12 consecutive victories, 10 by knockout. "Hey, Janitor!" Derek frequently shouted when he saw Jake passing with the cleaning cart. "Make sure my training area is perfect. I can't afford to step on any dirt you might have left behind." Jake just nodded and went on his way. There was no anger in his response, just a deep resignation that had become his constant companion. He had learned that responding only brought more problems, and problems were something he couldn't afford to face. During breaks between training sessions, Jake sat in his chair in the storage room and held the photo he carried in his pocket. It was a black and white image, worn at the edges, showing a young boxer raising a trophy over his head. The face in the photo was his, but it seemed to belong to another person, another time, another life. Sometimes, when the academy was particularly quiet, Jake closed his eyes and could almost feel the leather of the gloves in his hands again. He could hear the crowd shouting his name, feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins before an important fight. But these moments lasted only seconds before the noise of a heavy bag or a trainer's shout brought him back to reality. The reality was that Jake Thompson, at 45, was a man who had become an expert at being invisible. And perhaps, if things had followed their normal course, he would have remained that way forever. Just another forgotten employee in an academy full of dreamers and fighters. But fate had other plans for Jake Thompson, and everything would start to change on the night when his invisibility finally became impossible to maintain. 23 years earlier, the name Jake "Thunder" Thompson echoed through boxing arenas across the American Midwest. At 22, he was a hurricane in the rings, fast, precise, and with a devastating punch that had left 17 opponents on the canvas throughout his meteoric career. Jake grew up on the south side of Chicago, son of Margaret Thompson, a nurse who worked 2 shifts to support the family after his father abandoned them when Jake was only 8 years old. The boy found refuge in boxing through the local church's community program, where Pastor Williams had installed a small gym in the basement. "This boy has fire in his fists," Pastor Williams used to say, watching Jake train with improvised sandbags. "But more importantly, he has discipline in his heart." Jake's discipline was legendary. He woke up at 5 in the morning to run through the dangerous neighborhood streets, attended all his classes, even when his friends skipped school, and spent every afternoon training until his hands bled. His mother, Margaret, worked tirelessly to pay for proper equipment, real gloves, a mouthguard, appropriate training shoes. "My son is going to be somebody in life," she told the neighbors, with pride shining in her tired eyes. "He's going to get out of here and make a difference in the world." And for a while, it seemed Margaret was right. Jake won all the state youth championships, caught the attention of professional promoters, and at 19 signed his first contract for professional fights. The money wasn't much at first, but it was enough to get him and his mother out of the tiny apartment where they lived and move them to a better place in Wicker Park. The victories accumulated. Jake "Thunder" Thompson became known for his deadly combination, quick jab, powerful straight right, and a supernatural ability to read his opponent's movements. Experienced trainers said he had boxing vision, the rare ability to see openings that others didn't even realize existed. Tommy the Tiger Rodriguez was his first nationally ranked opponent. The fight took place at the UIC Pavilion in Chicago in front of 8,000 screaming people. Jake remembered every detail of that night. The smell of sweat mixed with ring wax, the blinding lights above his head, the deafening noise of the crowd when he connected the uppercut that dropped Rodriguez in the 5th round. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice echoed through the arena, "by technical knockout in the 5th round, Jake "Thunder" Thompson." His mother was in the front row, crying with emotion, holding a handmade sign that said, "That's my son." Jake jumped over the ropes and hugged her, whispering in her ear, "We did it, Mom. We finally did it." The next 2 years were a blur of victories, television interviews, and increasingly lucrative contracts. Jake bought a house for his mother in Lincoln Park, a neighborhood they used to only pass through by bus. He hired the best trainers, nutritionists, and even a sports psychologist. The press began talking about a possible title fight. Jake was undefeated in 20 fights, with 17 knockouts. Las Vegas promoters called constantly, offering contracts that would make him a millionaire before age 25. But it was exactly when everything seemed perfect that Jake's life began to fall apart. It all started with a pain in his right hand during a routine training session. "Just a strain," said the team doctor. "2 weeks of rest and you'll be ready to return." But 2 weeks became a month, and a month became 3. Tests revealed a complex fracture in the scaphoid, a small but crucial bone in the wrist. "We can operate," explained the orthopedic surgeon, "but there are no guarantees. This type of injury sometimes never heals completely, especially for a boxer." Jake chose surgery. What other option did he have? During the 6 months of recovery, he watched fights on television, seeing other fighters take the spots that should have been his. His sponsors began to drift away, and calls from promoters became increasingly rare. When he finally returned to the ring, something had changed. The explosion in his right straight had diminished. The confidence that was once unshakable began to show cracks. In the first fight after his return, against an opponent who should have been easy, Jake was knocked down in the 3rd round for the first time in his career. "It's just rust," he told reporters after the fight. "Next time will be different." But it wasn't different. The defeats began to accumulate. Fighters who once respected him now saw him as an easy opportunity to improve their own records. In 2 years, Jake had lost 7 of his last 10 fights. The night that changed everything forever happened in a small gym in Milwaukee. Jake was fighting an unknown named Eddie Morales, a 19-year-old kid who was just starting his career. Jake, at 25, should have been the experienced veteran teaching the rookie a lesson. Instead, Eddie Morales knocked out Jake Thompson in the 2nd round with a left hook that Jake should have seen coming from miles away. Jake woke up in the hospital 3 hours later, with his mother holding his hand and tears streaming down her face. "It's over, Mom," he whispered, his voice hoarse and defeated. "It's all over." Margaret Thompson squeezed her son's hand tighter. "No, dear. One door closed, but others will open. You're still my champion." But Jake didn't feel like a champion. He felt like a failure, like someone who had wasted a rare gift and disappointed all the people who believed in him. In the years that followed, Jake tried everything: trainer, sports commentator, even car salesman. Nothing lasted very long. The shadow of what he had been followed him everywhere. People recognized him and whispered, "Isn't that Jake Thompson? What happened to him?" Eventually, Jake stopped trying. He accepted humble jobs, work where no one asked questions about his past. Night security, delivery driver, janitor, anything that paid the bills and kept him invisible. His mother died of cancer 5 years ago, taking with her the last person who still believed in Jake Thompson's potential. At the funeral, only a dozen people attended. Some neighbors, Pastor Williams, and a retired sports reporter who had covered Jake's glory days. "Your mother never stopped talking about you," Pastor Williams told Jake after the service. "She knew that one day you would find your way back." But Jake had buried his boxing gloves along with his mother. At least, that's what he thought. Now, 3 years later, working as a janitor in an academy where no one knew who he had been, Jake carried the weight of all these memories in silence. The photo in his pocket was all that remained of Jake "Thunder" Thompson, a painful reminder of a dream that had turned into a nightmare. But sometimes, late at night, when the academy was empty and silent, Jake stood in front of the rings and could swear he still felt the ghost of that old flame burning in his chest. And maybe, just maybe, that flame wasn't completely extinguished. It was a typical Friday in November in Chicago, with cold wind cutting through the streets and the promise of snow in the air. Jake arrived at the academy earlier than usual, at 4:30 in the morning, because there was a special competition scheduled for that evening. A series of amateur fights that would attract dozens of spectators and fighters from other academies around the city. Brian Sullivan had hired Jake to work overtime, ensuring everything was perfect for the event. "There'll be important people here today," Brian said, nervously adjusting his tie. "Promoters, businessmen, even a guy from HBO Sports." "I need everything to shine, Jake." Jake nodded silently and began his work. He cleaned every inch of the two main rings, arranged chairs for spectators, and double-checked that all equipment was working perfectly. By 7 in the evening, when the first guests began to arrive, the academy looked like a gleaming temple dedicated to the noble art of boxing. Derek Martinez arrived at 7:30, driving his Camaro as always, but this time accompanied by an entourage of friends, girlfriend, and even some local reporters. Derek had won his last fight by knockout in the first round, and rumors were circulating that he was close to signing a contract for a nationally televised fight. "This is my house," Derek told the reporters, spreading his arms theatrically. "This is where I dominate. This is where I show that I'm the future of heavyweight boxing." Jake watched from afar, discreetly cleaning windows near the entrance. There was something about Derek's arrogance that deeply bothered him, not the confidence of a true champion, but the arrogance of someone who had never faced real adversity. The evening went without incident until the main fight. Derek was scheduled to face a veteran fighter named Carlos Mendez, a 34-year-old Mexican who had had a respectable career but never reached the top. He was exactly the type of opponent Derek preferred. Experienced enough to give credibility to the victory, but already past his prime. Jake was in the storage room organizing equipment when he heard the first screams coming from the main gym. They weren't the normal screams of a crowd watching boxing. There was something different, more aggressive, almost cruel. He approached the door and peeked through the small window. Derek had knocked out Mendez in the second round, but instead of celebrating with dignity, he was taunting the fallen opponent, flexing his muscles for the crowd and shouting something Jake couldn't fully understand. "Anyone else want to try?" Derek roared, climbing on the ring ropes. "Anyone here have the courage to come up and face a real fighter?" The crowd laughed and applauded, but Jake noticed that some of the more experienced fighters exchanged uncomfortable glances. Taunting a defeated opponent wasn't champion behavior. It was bully behavior. Derek climbed down from the ring and began circling the academy, still pumped with adrenaline from the victory. His friends followed him like hyenas, feeding his ego with exaggerated compliments. "Dude, you're a machine," one of them shouted. "Nobody here comes close to your level," said another. That's when Derek spotted Jake, who had discreetly left the storage room to check if any equipment had been damaged during the fight. "Hey!" Derek shouted, pointing directly at Jake. "Hey, old man, did you see that?" Jake stopped, feeling all eyes in the academy turn toward him. There were at least 50 people there, fighters, trainers, spectators, reporters, all now looking at the silent janitor who rarely drew attention to himself. "I'm talking to you, man," Derek insisted, approaching with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Did you see how I destroyed that guy?" Jake nodded briefly, trying to move away, but Derek blocked his path. "You know what your problem is?" Derek said, his voice rising so everyone could hear. "You stand there, cleaning our mess, dreaming of being like us. But you never will be, man. You know why?" The academy became dangerously quiet. Jake could feel the heat rising to his face, but kept his eyes down. "Because you're not a fighter!" Derek roared, making the crowd explode in nervous laughter. "You're just a failed janitor who cleans up our mess. You probably never even stepped in a ring in your life." The words hit Jake like physical punches. Each laugh from the crowd was a blade, cutting the old wounds he had tried to keep closed. He could feel his hands trembling, not from fear, but from a rage he hadn't felt in over 20 years. "Look at that," Derek continued, now clearly enjoying the situation. "The old guy is even shaking. I bet if I got closer, he'd run away like a coward." Derek took another step toward Jake, who finally raised his eyes. For a moment, something passed between the two men. A flash of recognition, as if Derek had seen something in Jake's eyes that he didn't expect to find. But the moment passed quickly, and Derek returned to his performance for the audience. "I have an idea," Derek said, climbing back into the ring and addressing the crowd. "How about our janitor here comes up and shows us how it's done? Just for fun, of course. I promise I'll take it easy on the old guy." The crowd exploded in laughter and encouraging shouts. Some younger fighters began clapping rhythmically, creating unbearable pressure. "Come on, janitor!" someone shouted. "Show us what you can do!" shouted another. Jake looked around the academy. He saw faces he had known for 3 years, fighters he greeted every day, trainers who had always been respectful, even Brian Sullivan, who was clearly uncomfortable but said nothing to stop the humiliation. And then Jake saw something that broke his heart. In the back of the crowd, there was a boy, about 16 years old, clearly new to the academy, looking at Jake with a mixture of pity and vicarious embarrassment. It was the same look Jake used to see on people's faces when his career collapsed, pure compassion for someone who had fallen so low. "So," Derek shouted from the ring, "are you going to stand there like a statue? Or are you going to show if you have any courage hidden in there?" Jake felt something break inside him. Not anger, not shame, but something much deeper. An absolute refusal to continue being invisible, to continue allowing them to step on his dignity. He dropped the cleaning cloth he was holding and took a step toward the ring. The academy fell into absolute silence. "All right," Jake said, his voice low but clear enough for everyone to hear. "I accept." Derek stopped smiling. The crowd stopped laughing. Even the reporters stopped talking among themselves. "Sorry, what did you say?" Derek asked, as if he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. Jake raised his head and, for the first time in years, looked directly into the eyes of someone who was challenging him. "I said I accept," Jake repeated, louder this time. "Whenever you want." And in that moment, Jake Thompson, the invisible janitor, the failed dreamer, the ghost of a forgotten champion, began the longest walk of his life toward the ring where it all began, and where everything was about to start again. The silence that overtook the academy after Jake accepted the challenge lasted only a few seconds, but for him it seemed like an eternity. 50 pairs of eyes watched him, some incredulous, others amused, but all waiting to see if the silent janitor really had the courage to get in the ring with Derek Martinez. Brian Sullivan was the first to react, pushing through the crowd and quickly approaching Jake. "Jake, man, you don't have to do this," Brian whispered urgently. "This got out of hand." Derek was just messing around, you know how he is. But Jake had already made his decision. For the first time in years, he felt completely awake, as if he were emerging from a long and confusing dream. Every muscle in his body vibrated with an energy he thought he had lost forever. "No, Brian," Jake said calmly, putting his hand on the academy owner's shoulder. "It's time." Derek, still in the ring, had regained his composure and returned to smiling, but Jake noticed the smile wasn't as confident as before. "Wait a minute, old guy," Derek said, laughing forcedly. "Are you serious? Because I don't want to hurt you. You probably have family, grandchildren maybe." "I'm 45, not 80, Jake replied, starting to head to the locker room. "And yes, I'm serious." The crowd exploded in excited conversations. Some thought it was madness. Others were clearly excited about the prospect of seeing something completely unexpected. Local reporters immediately began making calls. A story like this, even if it ended quickly, would certainly generate some interesting headlines. In the locker room, Jake sat on the bench and took off his work uniform for the first time in years with a different purpose than just going home. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the locker where Brian kept extra equipment for visitors. Tommy Sullivan, Brian's younger brother, and the academy's head trainer entered the locker room with a worried expression. "Jake, I know you're upset, but this isn't going to end well," Tommy said, sitting next to him. "Derek is 12 years younger than you, at the peak of physical condition, and just knocked out a guy in 2 rounds. You could get seriously hurt here." Jake stopped changing and looked directly at Tommy. "Tommy, you've known me for 3 years. Have I ever given you reason to think I'm crazy or impulsive?" Tommy shook his head. "Then trust me when I say I know exactly what I'm doing." There was something in Jake's tone of voice that made Tommy back down. It was a quiet confidence, a certainty that didn't match the shy janitor he knew. While Jake finished changing, Brian entered the locker room with a pair of used boxing gloves. "If you're really going to do this, at least use decent equipment," Brian said, clearly reluctant. "And Jake, if it gets ugly out there, I'm stopping the fight, okay? I don't care what Derek or anyone else says." Jake nodded and began putting on the gloves. The familiar leather in his hands awakened a cascade of memories. Thousands of hours of training, dozens of fights, the feeling of power and control that he thought he had lost forever. "Brian," Jake said, adjusting the gloves with movements that seemed automatic. "Do you have the keys to your office upstairs?" "I do. Why?" "After the fight, I want to show you something. Something that will explain a lot." Before Brian could ask what Jake meant, the janitor was already heading for the locker room door. Back in the main gym, the atmosphere had completely changed. The crowd had doubled in size. News that something unusual was happening spread quickly, and people from the neighborhood began to show up. Someone had even set up a live stream on social media. Derek was doing elaborate warm-ups in the center of the ring, clearly enjoying the extra attention. He had changed clothes and now wore professional shorts and expensive boxing shoes. To any observer, the disparity between the two fighters was glaring. Derek looked like a modern gladiator, while Jake wore borrowed shorts and old running shoes. But when Jake climbed the ring stairs, something changed in the academy's atmosphere. His movements were fluid, economical, like those of someone who had climbed those same stairs hundreds of times before. He tested the ropes with an experienced touch, checked the canvas's elasticity with his feet, and positioned himself in his corner with a naturalness that surprised even Derek. "Folks," Tommy Sullivan grabbed an improvised microphone, "you're going to watch 3 rounds of amateur boxing between Derek Martinez and—" He hesitated, realizing he didn't know Jake's full last name. "Jake Thompson," Jake said calmly from his corner, and some older people in the crowd exchanged confused looks, as if the name was vaguely familiar to them. Derek laughed loudly. "Thompson? Seriously? Man, do you even know how to put in a mouthguard?" Jake didn't respond. Instead, he did something no one expected. He began to warm up. But these weren't the uncoordinated movements of a nervous amateur. Jake began with fluid shadow boxing, his fists cutting through the air with surgical precision. His feet moved in a complex pattern, as if he were dancing a choreography he knew by heart. The conversation in the crowd gradually diminished. Even Derek stopped making jokes and began observing more attentively. Jake executed a sequence of combinations, jab, straight, hook, uppercut, that flowed into each other with hypnotizing naturalness. His movements were economical, without wasted energy, each punch ending in the exact position for the next to begin. "My God," whispered one of the older trainers to Brian. "This guy knows what he's doing." When the improvised bell rang for the start of the first round, Derek advanced aggressively, clearly trying to end the fight quickly. He threw a series of heavy jabs, expecting Jake to retreat or cover up defensively. Instead, Jake simply wasn't there when the punches arrived. Derek swung at air 3 times in a row, his fists finding only emptiness where Jake had been milliseconds before. The janitor moved as if he could predict exactly where each punch would be thrown. "What the hell?" Derek muttered, stopping for a moment, confused. Jake used this hesitation to launch his first attack, a quick jab that found Derek's nose with surgical precision. It wasn't a powerful punch, but it was perfectly timed and placed. Derek stepped back, surprised, instinctively touching his nose. "You got lucky, old man," Derek growled, advancing again. But it wasn't luck. For the next 2 minutes, Jake completely dominated the center of the ring. He dodged Derek's attacks with minimal movements, tilting his head a few inches to the left, stepping back at the exact moment, rotating his shoulders to deflect hooks. And with each dodge, Jake responded with precise counterattacks. Jabs that found Derek's face, straights that hit the body, hooks that connected to the ribs with a dry sound that echoed through the silent academy. Derek was clearly frustrated. He was bigger, younger, supposedly stronger, but couldn't hit the man who should have been an easy victim. Worse still, he was taking a technical beating from someone who, 20 minutes ago, he had called a coward. When the bell rang for the end of the first round, Derek returned to his corner, breathing heavily and with a small cut above his left eyebrow. Jake, on the other hand, seemed as calm as when the fight began. The crowd was in absolute silence. Even the reporters had stopped taking notes to simply observe. Brian approached Jake's corner during the break. "Jake, who the hell are you?" Brian asked in a low voice. Jake took out his mouthguard and smiled for the first time in years. Not a sad or resigned smile, but the smile of someone who had finally remembered who he really was. "After the fight," Jake said, "I promise I'll explain everything." The second round began with Derek trying a different approach. Instead of attacking frantically, he tried to use his greater reach to keep Jake at a distance. But Jake simply entered Derek's guard, as if the young fighter's defenses didn't exist. It was in the middle of the second round that Jake decided to show a little more of what he could do. Derek threw a wild right hook that would have knocked out most opponents if it had connected. Jake not only dodged, he ducked completely under the punch, spun his body, and responded with a devastating uppercut that caught Derek completely off guard. The sound of impact echoed through the academy like a gunshot. Derek staggered backward, his eyes glazed for a moment, clearly shaken. But Jake didn't follow up to finish. Instead, he backed away and assumed his guard position again, waiting for Derek to recover. "Finish him!" someone in the crowd shouted. Jake shook his head. This wasn't a fight to prove he could hurt Derek. It was a fight to prove something very different. The third round was a complete demonstration of technical mastery. Jake controlled every second, dictating the pace, choosing exactly when to attack and when to defend. Derek, now completely frustrated and tired, began making basic mistakes, dropping his guard, telegraphing his punches, losing his balance. With 30 seconds left in the final round, Jake did something no one expected. He stopped fighting completely and extended his hand to Derek. "You're a good fighter," Jake said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You have potential to be even better, but you need to learn that strength isn't everything in this sport." Derek looked at the extended hand, then at Jake, then at the silent crowd. Slowly, he extended his own hand and shook it. When the final bell rang, there was no loud celebration or taunts. The academy was in absolute silence, with everyone trying to process what they had just witnessed. Jake Thompson, the invisible janitor, had given a boxing lesson to one of Chicago's most promising fighters. And he had done it without humiliating or destroying his opponent. He had done it with the dignity and respect of a true champion. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. Because Jake was ready to tell everyone exactly who he really was. In the 3 days that followed the fight with Derek, Jake Thompson lived in 2 worlds simultaneously. During the day, he continued being the silent janitor at Fight Club Chicago, cleaning equipment and organizing the space as he always had. But at night, when the academy was empty and the lights went out, Jake transformed into someone completely different. The revelation of his identity after the fight had caused an earthquake in Chicago's boxing community. Brian Sullivan almost fainted when Jake showed him the newspaper clippings kept in his office. Photos of Jake "Thunder" Thompson raising trophies, headlines about his victories, and even a boxing monthly magazine from 1998 with Jake on the cover. "You're a living legend," Brian had whispered, leafing through the clippings with trembling hands. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" "Because that man died a long time ago," Jake replied. "Or at least, that's what I thought." The news spread quickly. Videos of the fight against Derek went viral on social media, with millions of views in just 48 hours. Sports journalists who had covered Jake's original career began calling the academy, wanting interviews. Promoters from other cities sent representatives to Chicago, but the call that changed everything came on Tuesday night. "Jake Thompson?" The voice on the phone was professional, but loaded with emotion. "This is Michael Rodriguez from Golden Boy Promotions. Do you remember me?" Jake remembered. Michael was the son of Tommy the Tiger Rodriguez, the first-ranked opponent Jake had defeated in his original career. Michael was only 10 years old at the time, sitting in the front row watching his father get knocked out. "I remember, Michael. How's your father?" "He's fine, thanks for asking. But Jake, I'm not calling to talk about the past. I'm calling about the future." Michael explained that he had watched the videos of the fight against Derek dozens of times. He had shown them to other promoters, experienced commentators, sports doctors. The consensus was unanimous. Jake Thompson still had a lot of boxing left in him. "I want to offer you a fight," Michael said directly. "A real fight, professional, televised, in 6 weeks at Navy Pier. The opponent would be Ricardo El Toro Vasquez." Jake almost dropped the phone. Ricardo Vasquez was one of the most respected heavyweights on the circuit, a 38-year-old veteran with 34 wins and only 3 losses. He wasn't a top-tier name, but he was a solid fighter who would test any opponent. "Michael, I'm 45 years old," Jake said. "I haven't fought professionally in over 20 years. "Jake, I saw what you did to Derek Martinez. Derek may be young and inexperienced, but he has real power. And you dominated him completely, using only technique and intelligence. Imagine what you could do with 6 weeks of proper preparation." Jake looked around the empty academy. The rings, the heavy bags, the equipment he cleaned every day. Everything seemed different now, loaded with possibilities he had considered dead forever. "I need to think about it," Jake said finally. "Of course. But Jake, this might be your chance to end your career the right way, on your own terms." After hanging up the phone, Jake stayed alone in the academy until 2 in the morning, walking between the rings and trying to make the most important decision of his life. On Wednesday night, Jake called Michael Rodriguez back. "I accept," he said simply. "Fantastic. We'll take care of all the details. You'll need a trainer, a physical trainer, medical exams." "I already have a trainer," Jake interrupted, looking at Tommy Sullivan, who had stayed at the academy after normal hours to discuss the offer with Jake. Tommy had been hesitant at first. "Jake, I respect you a lot, but training a 45-year-old fighter for a professional fight, that's a huge responsibility." But Jake had convinced Tommy by showing him something few people knew. Even after stopping professional fighting, Jake had never stopped studying boxing. He watched all the important fights, analyzed techniques, kept up with the sport's evolution. His technical knowledge was as deep as any professional trainer's. "I don't need to learn how to fight again," Jake explained. "I need to remember how to fight, and I need to get my body in condition to do it for 12 rounds. The preparation began immediately. Jake asked for leave from his janitor job. Brian not only approved, but offered to use the academy for free for training. "Having Jake Thompson preparing here will put this place on the map," Brian said, clearly excited. The first challenge was physical. At 45, Jake's body was no longer the same one that had dominated rings 2 decades ago. His joints were stiffer, his cardiovascular endurance had decreased, and he carried about 15 pounds more than his ideal fighting weight. Tommy set up a military training program. 5-kilometer runs at 5 in the morning, followed by 2 hours of technical work in the ring, 1 hour of weight training, and another hour of heavy bag work. In the afternoon, Jake did yoga for flexibility, swimming for endurance, and sessions with a nutritionist to lose weight healthily. "You're crazy," Derek Martinez said on Thursday, showing up at the academy during one of Jake's training sessions. "Ricardo Vasquez is going to destroy you." But there was respect in Derek's voice now. The public humiliation had been replaced by genuine curiosity about the man who had revealed himself to be much more than he appeared. "Maybe," Jake replied, stopping his work on the heavy bag. "But at least I'll find out what I'm still capable of." Derek stayed watching Jake work for a full hour. The older man's movements were different now, more deliberate, less explosive than in his youth, but with almost mechanical precision. Each punch was thrown with specific purpose. Each movement was economically perfect. "Do you want to train with me?" Jake asked eventually. Derek was surprised. "Seriously? You have speed and power that I don't have anymore," Jake explained. "I have experience and technique that you haven't developed yet. We can help each other." From that afternoon on, Derek became Jake's main sparring partner. It was a strange dynamic. The young fighter who had publicly humiliated the janitor was now receiving technical lessons from the man he had underestimated. "You telegraphed that hook from 3 meters away," Jake would say, after easily blocking one of Derek's attacks. "An experienced fighter like Vasquez will see that coming and counterattack before you complete the movement." Now, in the first 2 weeks, Jake lost 8 pounds and recovered much of his flexibility. In weeks 3 and 4, his cardiovascular endurance returned to the level needed to handle 12 rounds of professional boxing. But it was in the 5th week that something truly special happened. Jake was training sparring with Derek when Tommy stopped the session in the middle of the 3rd round. "Jake," Tommy said, taking Jake's mouthguard out, "do you realize what you just did?" Jake shook his head, confused. "You hit Derek with 8 consecutive punches in the last 2 minutes, and he couldn't touch you once. You're not just returning to your previous level, you're fighting better than ever." It was true. Maturity had given Jake something he didn't have at 25, absolute patience. He no longer needed to prove anything to anyone or impress crowds with displays of power. Now he fought with the wisdom of someone who understood that boxing, at its highest level, was as much a mental art as a physical one. "Ricardo Vasquez is an intelligent fighter," Jake said during a press conference in the 6th week. "He has more recent experience than me, is in better physical shape, and is certainly hungrier for victory. But I have something he doesn't have." "What would that be?" asked a reporter. Jake smiled, the same confident smile that had captivated audiences 2 decades ago. "I have 20 years of accumulated longing. 20 years thinking about all the fights I could have won, all the dreams I let die too early. Ricardo will be fighting for money and ranking. I'll be fighting for my soul." 2 nights before the fight, Jake visited his mother's grave for the first time since the funeral. He knelt before the simple headstone and whispered, "Mom, I know you always said I would find my way back. It took longer than we expected, but I think I'm finally ready to finish what we started together." The cold Chicago wind blew through the cemetery, and for a moment Jake could swear he heard Margaret Thompson's voice whispering back, "I always knew, my champion. I always knew." Navy Pier had never seen a night like that one. 12,000 people filled the temporary arena built specifically for the fight, while millions watched on national television. The event had captured the American public's imagination in a way no one anticipated. The story of the janitor, who revealed himself to be a forgotten boxing legend, had become a national sensation. Jake arrived at the venue 4 hours before the fight, driving the same old Honda Civic he used to go to work at the academy. There was no luxury entourage, imported cars or private security, just Jake, Tommy Sullivan and Derek Martinez, who had insisted on being part of Jake's team, saying he wanted to see up close how a real legend prepares. "Are you nervous?" Derek asked, as they walked through the Navy Pier corridors. Jake shook his head. Nervous, no. Anxious, yes. There's a difference. What's the difference? Nervousness is fear of failing. Anxiety is excitement to do something you know you can do well. In the locker rooms, Jake followed the same routine he had developed 20 years ago. First, 15 minutes of silent meditation, then gradual warm-up, starting with slow movements and progressively increasing intensity. Finally, visualization. Jake closed his eyes and mentally saw each round of the fight, anticipating movements, planning strategies. Tommy had studied Ricardo Vasquez exhaustively during the 6 weeks of preparation. El Toro was a technically solid fighter who relied on constant pressure and knockout power. At 38, he was still formidable, but there were signs of decline. His speed had slightly decreased, and he tended to tire in the final rounds of long fights. The strategy is simple, Tommy explained for the last time. Use your experience to control the first rounds. Keep distance, work the jab, make him tire trying to reach you. If you can get to the 8th round in good condition, the fight is yours. But Jake had other plans. Tommy, he said while Tommy helped put on his gloves, I didn't come here to survive 12 rounds. I came here to remind everyone who Jake Thompson is. Down the hall, Ricardo Vasquez was preparing with his usual team, a veteran Cuban trainer, 2 assistants, and a cutman who had worked with world champions. Ricardo had seen the videos of Jake's fight against Derek, but wasn't impressed. He dominated an inexperienced kid, Ricardo told reporters earlier. That doesn't mean anything against a real professional. Jake Thompson was good 20 years ago, but tonight he'll discover that time forgives no one. When it came time to walk to the ring, Jake did something that surprised everyone. Instead of using intimidating or energetic music, he chose Amazing Grace, the same song that had played at his mother's funeral. The walk to the ring lasted only 2 minutes, but for Jake, it was a journey through his entire life. He saw faces in the crowd who recognized him from his original career. Old fans who had come to watch his fights again, former fighters who had shared cards with him, journalists who had covered his rise and fall. But the most emotional moment came when Jake climbed into the ring and saw, in the front row, Pastor Williams, now 78 years old, bald and using a cane, but with the same kind eyes that had seen potential in a troubled kid from Chicago's South Side 40 years ago. Pastor Williams waved to Jake and shouted something only Jake could hear amid the crowd's noise. "Your mother is watching, son." Jake had to blink several times to hold back tears. Ricardo Vasquez entered the ring 3 minutes later, accompanied by energetic Latin music and an elaborate display of confidence. He was visibly larger than Jake, 3 inches taller, longer arms, broader shoulders. To any casual observer, the physical difference was intimidating. When the announcer introduced the fighters, the arena exploded. Introducing first, in the blue corner, weighing 216 pounds, Ricardo El Toro Vasquez from Guadalajara, Mexico. The response was respectful but not enthusiastic. Ricardo was known to boxing fans, but wasn't a star. And in the red corner, weighing 209 pounds, the former champion returning after 20 years of retirement, Jake "Thunder" Thompson from Chicago, Illinois. The arena exploded. 12,000 people stood simultaneously, creating deafening noise that lasted almost 2 minutes. Jake looked around, absorbing every moment, knowing that regardless of the fight's outcome, he had already won something much more important than any championship belt. When the referee called both fighters to the center of the ring for final instructions, Ricardo tried to intimidate Jake with the traditional stare-down. Jake simply smiled and extended his hand. "Let's have a good fight," Jake said calmly. Ricardo shook the hand, but Jake noticed slight hesitation in the Mexican's eyes. There was already doubt there. The first round began exactly as Tommy had predicted. Ricardo advanced aggressively, trying to use his size and strength advantage to pressure Jake against the ropes. But Jake danced around the ring as if he were 30 again, using perfect footwork to maintain distance and scoring points with precise jabs. "He's reading Vasquez like a book," commented the television narrator. "Jake Thompson is showing that experience and intelligence can compensate for years of inactivity." The second round was a demonstration of classic boxing. Jake established his jab as a dominant weapon, hitting Ricardo repeatedly and avoiding most of the Mexican's counterattacks. When Ricardo managed to get close, Jake used intelligent clinches to neutralize his opponent's inside work. It was in the third round that Jake decided to show he hadn't come just to survive. Ricardo threw a violent left hook that would have knocked out most opponents. Jake not only dodged, he ducked completely under the punch, pivoted on his right foot, and responded with a devastating uppercut that caught Ricardo coming up. The sound of impact echoed through the arena. Ricardo staggered backward, his eyes glazed, clearly shaken. The crowd exploded, sensing a knockout was near. But Jake did something no one expected. Instead of following up to finish, he backed away and let Ricardo recover. "Why didn't he finish him?" Derek shouted from the corner. Tommy understood immediately. "He doesn't want to knock out Vasquez. He wants to prove he can dominate a professional for 12 complete rounds." The following rounds were a boxing clinic. Jake completely controlled the fight, dictating the pace, choosing when to attack and when to defend, making Ricardo look slow and predictable. In the 8th round, Ricardo was clearly frustrated, throwing wild punches that Jake easily dodged. In the 10th round, something magical happened. Jake began using combinations he hadn't used in 20 years, complex sequences of punches that flowed into each other like music. The crowd began applauding not just the points scored, but the pure technical beauty of what they were witnessing. "Ladies and gentlemen," said the commentator with clear emotion in his voice, "you're watching one of the most impressive performances in boxing history. Jake Thompson isn't just winning this fight, he's giving a masterclass." In the final 2 rounds, Ricardo desperately tried to find the lucky punch that could change the fight. But Jake was 2 moves ahead of every movement, anticipating and neutralizing everything the Mexican tried. When the bell rang for the end of the 12th round, the entire arena stood in ovation. Even Ricardo Vasquez applauded, recognizing he had just shared the ring with something special. Jake walked to the center of the ring and respectfully embraced Ricardo. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity," Jake whispered in the Mexican's ear. "Thank you for reminding me why I love this sport," Ricardo replied. The result was unanimous. 120, 108, 119, 109, 118, 110, all for Jake Thompson. But the scorecards were just numbers. What really mattered was in the faces of the 12,000 people in the arena and the millions watching at home. Jake Thompson had proven that delayed dreams aren't necessarily dead dreams. He had shown that age is just a number when you have purpose, determination, and the courage to face your fears. In the center of the ring, with his hands raised in victory, Jake looked to the sky and whispered, "We did it, Mom. We finally did it." 6 months after the fight that redefined his life, Jake Thompson stood in the same ring where it all began again, but this time as owner of the academy that once employed him as a janitor. Brian Sullivan had offered to sell his stake in Fight Club Chicago to Jake, who used the money from the Vasquez fight purse to make the investment. "Feels surreal, doesn't it?" Derek Martinez said, adjusting his gloves before his morning training. Derek had become not only one of Jake's main students, but also his partner in the academy. The public humiliation of that Friday night had transformed into one of the most unlikely friendships in the boxing world. "I'm still getting used to it," Jake admitted, watching the academy that now buzzed with activity. What had once been a relatively small place had expanded to include 2 new rings, state-of-the-art equipment, and a special room dedicated to training neighborhood youth, offered free to any child who showed interest and discipline. The victory over Ricardo Vasquez had transformed Jake into a national sensation. Lucrative fight offers arrived weekly, Las Vegas promoters called constantly, and even Hollywood had become interested in the rights to his story for a movie. But Jake had declined almost all offers. One fight was enough, he explained to Michael Rodriguez when he refused a $2 million offer to face a former world champion. "I didn't come back to make a career. I came back to close a circle." Instead, Jake had chosen to dedicate his energy to something he considered much more important, giving other people the opportunity he had almost lost forever. The Second Chances program, created by Jake 3 months after the fight, offered free boxing training to anyone over 35 who wanted to return to the sport or try it for the first time. The idea had emerged when a 42-year-old accountant showed up at the academy, inspired by Jake's story, wanting to learn boxing after a lifetime of sedentary living. "It doesn't matter your age or experience," Jake would say in the first class of each new group. "If you have the will to try, I have time to teach." The program had become a phenomenon. Stressed executives, bored housewives, retirees looking for purpose, all found in Jake's academy not just physical exercise, but a community of people who had decided it was never too late to pursue something new. Martha Coleman, a 58-year-old retired teacher, had become one of the program's most notable success stories. She had arrived at the academy 5 months ago, weighing 265 pounds and suffering from depression after her husband's death. Now, she had lost 66 pounds, competed in amateur tournaments, and had returned to teaching. But this time, teaching literature to the academy's young boxers. "Jake gave me back my life," Martha said during an interview for a documentary being produced about the academy. "He showed me I didn't have to accept that my best days were behind me." But perhaps the most significant transformation wasn't that of any of Jake's students, but his own. The man who had spent 20 years trying to become invisible was now sought after by people from around the world who wanted to hear his story. On a Tuesday morning, Jake was training with a group of teenagers from the community program when he received an unexpected visit. Pastor Williams, now 79 years old, had arrived at the academy, accompanied by a boy about 12 years old, whom Jake immediately recognized. It was Marcus, the pastor's grandson, who was having problems at school and at home. "Jake," Pastor Williams said, with the same gentle voice that had guided Jake decades ago, "I was wondering if you could do for Marcus what you did for me when I was young." Jake looked at the boy, who kept his eyes down and fists clenched. The same defensive posture Jake had adopted at 8 years old. There was anger there, but also pain, and Jake immediately recognized the signs of a child who was lost and needed direction. "Of course," Jake said, kneeling to get to the boy's height. "Marcus, do you want to learn to fight?" The boy finally raised his eyes, and Jake saw in them the same flame his mother had seen in him 40 years ago. "Yes, sir," Marcus whispered. It was at that moment that Jake fully understood the purpose of his entire journey. It wasn't about glory, titles, or recognition. It was about continuing a cycle of transformation that had begun with Pastor Williams, passed through him, and would now continue through a new generation. Derek approached and watched Jake begin teaching the basic fundamentals to Marcus: how to make a proper fist, how to keep guard, how to plant feet. It was the same sequence Pastor Williams had taught Jake, that Jake had perfected over the years, and that he was now passing forward. "You know what's most incredible about all this?" Derek said quietly to Tommy, who had stopped to watch the impromptu class. "What?" 6 months ago, I thought I was humiliating a failed janitor. Actually, I was awakening one of the greatest masters this sport has ever seen. The academy had become much more than a training facility. It was a sanctuary where people of all ages came to rediscover their forgotten potential. Jake had created not just a boxing school, but a life philosophy based on the premise that it's never too late to get up after a fall. 3 weeks after Pastor Williams's visit, Jake received a phone call that left him speechless. "Mr. Thompson?" The voice was young, nervous. "My name is David Chen. I saw your story on television and, well, I wanted to ask if you could help me." David explained that he was a 28-year-old computer programmer who had been fired from his job after an anxiety attack during an important presentation. In the last 6 months, he had isolated himself at home, refusing job offers and losing confidence in himself. "I've never done boxing in my life," David admitted, "but your story showed me that sometimes we need to fight for ourselves, literally." Jake smiled. "David, show up here tomorrow at 6 in the morning. Let's see what we can do." David Chen became another living example of Jake's philosophy. In 3 months, he had not only recovered his confidence, but had created a meditation and exercise app based on the mental techniques Jake taught at the academy. The app had become a success, allowing David not only to return to the job market, but to create his own company. "Jake taught me that physical strength is just a small part of the fight," David said during the app's launch. "The real battle is mental, and the most important victory is the one we achieve over our own limitations." On the first anniversary of the Vasquez fight, the Academy organized a special party. Over 300 people attended, current and former students, journalists, other Academy owners, and even Ricardo Vasquez, who had flown from Guadalajara especially for the event. "Jake Thompson changed my life too," Ricardo said during a brief speech. "He reminded me why I started boxing, not for fame or money, but for pure love of the sport. Now I have my own academy in Mexico, teaching street children, and I use Jake as an example that we can always reinvent ourselves." During the party, Jake was approached by a Netflix documentary producer who wanted to make a series about academies that were transforming communities. Jake accepted, but with one condition: the focus should be on the students and their transformations, not on him. "My story has already been told," Jake explained. "Now it's time to tell their stories." The Second Chances series premiered 8 months later and became one of the platform's most watched documentaries. It showed not only Jake's journey, but the stories of dozens of people who had found purpose and renewal through boxing. Martha Coleman was featured as the teacher who discovered a new passion at 58, David Chen as the programmer who used boxing to overcome anxiety and build a tech empire, Marcus Williams as the troubled kid who became captain of his school's boxing team. Each story was different, but all shared the same central theme: it's never too late to fight for a better version of yourself. On a Sunday afternoon, 2 years after his fight against Vasquez, Jake was alone in the academy, organizing equipment after a long day of training. He stopped in front of the mirror where there was a framed poster of the fight, a photo of him with his hands raised in victory, the crowd standing in the background. But what made him most proud wasn't that image. It was the wall next to it, covered with graduation photos of students who had gone through the Second Chances program. David Chen receiving a Technology Innovation Award, Martha Coleman being honored as Educator of the Year, Marcus Williams winning a state youth tournament. Dozens of smiling faces, dozens of stories of overcoming, dozens of lives that had been touched by the same force that had transformed Jake Thompson from an invisible janitor into a living legend. Jake took from his pocket the faded photo he had carried for so many years, the image of him young, raising a trophy after a victory. But now there was another photo with it, a recent image of him, with all the program students, all smiling, all carrying the same expression of pride and determination. He carefully folded both photos and put them back in his pocket. The past and present, united by the same fundamental truth. The greatest fight any person can face isn't against an opponent in the ring, but against their own limitations and fears. And in that fight, Jake Thompson had learned it's never too late to declare yourself the winner. Today, 3 years after that Friday night that changed everything, Fight Club Chicago has become one of the most respected training centers in the country. Jake Thompson is recognized not just as a former champion who had a spectacular comeback, but as a visionary who proved that sport can be a powerful tool for social transformation. The Second Chances program has been replicated in over 50 academies across the United States. Jake's methodology, combining boxing technique with personal development and mentoring, has become the subject of study in physical education and sports psychology universities. Derek Martinez, now 31, has become one of the country's top heavyweight fighters, but always credits Jake as the man who taught him that true strength comes from humility and respect. He never forgot the lesson from that first fight. Never underestimate someone based only on what you see on the surface. But if you ask Jake Thompson what his greatest achievement is, he won't talk about belts, recognition, or fame. He'll talk about Marcus Williams, who at 15 has become a young leader in his school and community. About Martha Coleman, who at 60 opened her own academy for women over 50. About David Chen, who employs more than 100 people in his mental wellness-focused tech company. Boxing taught me that every ending can be a new beginning, Jake often tells new students. True victory isn't defeating your opponent, it's refusing to accept defeat as permanent. Jake Thompson's story has become much more than the story of a man who returned to fight at 45. It has become a manifesto about courage, perseverance, and the infinite human capacity to reinvent oneself. It proved that sometimes, when life knocks us down, the best response isn't to accept the fall, but to get up and show what we're really capable of. Because in the end, we're all fighters. The only question is, when will your time come to step into the ring and show the world who you really are? Jake Thompson answered that question at 45 as a janitor who refused to remain invisible. And if he could do it, maybe you can too. After all, it's never too late to discover the champion that exists within you.